A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 1. When I close my eyes, I see an image. It's the image of a small town at a very specific time of year, at a time in my life when things seemed easier. The world, what I knew of it, made sense to me. It allowed for all of the magic and wonder that my mind could create, while providing the safety and comfort of all-knowing adults who would always be there when I needed a meal or a hug, or the answer to a question that was driving my brain mad. At this point in my life, I was about 11 years old. In my world, not every kid had a smartphone and tablet. We would venture out in the morning and become unreachable until we returned home. Mind you, I'm not ancient. The internet and technology existed, but it wasn't something that my friends or I were particularly interested in. Imagine that. Imagine being out of touch. No emails, no text messages, no phone calls, no social media. Imagine living in whatever moment you were in, surrounded only by the people who were actually near you. Imagine walking with your eyes on your surroundings, without a constant stream of bad news pouring into your head from around the world 24 hours a day. Imagine your world being tangible rather than digital. Back then, I lived in a town called Huxley. It was nowhere near a large city, so I could go outside without hearing the steady hiss of white noise that surrounds me now. I could look up at the sky and not see one airplane flying overhead. Instead, we saw birds and heard wind, leaves rustling, branches clacking against each other in the woods, small animals scurrying nearby, heard but not always seen. When I close my eyes and picture the place, it's usually the image of late springtime. There's a cool breeze blowing across my face, carrying with it the smell of whatever was in bloom. I used to watch the breeze blow across the grass in my backyard as a kid. When the lawn hadn't been mowed for a while, you could see the wind sweep by from one end of the yard to the other. In my childhood mind, it looked like a monster rushing past, just beneath the surface. The thought should have scared my younger self, but it didn't. Back then, I liked the idea of things existing just out of sight. We never had wind chimes at my house, but some of my friends did. When I imagine Huxley, I can hear those chimes in the distance, creating the soundtrack to so many backyard battle scenes. School doesn't factor into this particular image because this would have been just after the end of the year. Other kids would be headed off on family vacations, but I usually stayed in town. My family was never big on extravagant trips. Sometimes we go to my grandparents' house for the 4th of July, but that was about it. The town itself seemed empty to me in those days, even if there were people on the sidewalks and cars on the road. I was used to being packed into small classrooms, elbow to elbow with other kids. At the beginning of summer break, things were too quiet. I kept waiting for a bell to ring, or an adult to wave their finger at me for not being wherever I was supposed to be. Except, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere. Huxley's town center looked like something out of an old movie. It was composed of mostly old brick buildings which had been restyled and revitalized several times since they were built. No matter how many layers of paint covered their walls or how many times their signs had been replaced, there was always something about those buildings which made me feel connected to the past. How many styles of shoes had crossed those thresholds? How many chalk drawings and games of tic-tac-toe had been washed off the brick walls by the passing rain? Of course, these thoughts were only vague concepts to my childhood mind. I didn't know what the feeling was at the time. I just knew that the town felt bigger than it was. In town, we had an ice cream shop and a library, but neither of those things were enough to lure me down to Main Street on most days. One of the most vivid memories I have of that area was just outside of town. There was a large field, with no telephone wires or buildings in sight, unless you count the remains of an old stone foundation to a house that had crumbled decades before I was born. The area was surrounded by just enough small hills to make for a good battlefield when my friends and I decided to wage wars against each other for fun. The hills provided not only the perfect cover for regrouping and strategizing, but also great places to get blown up by imaginary grenades. Because each time you fell down dead, you got to let your limp body roll down the side of a hill. That was a small perk of life that only a child would appreciate. The field led into woods toward the back, and the woods led to a river that flowed gently in this particular spot. This area was all we needed back then. Whatever terrain we wished to invade or defend, it was right there. While the field was fun when I had a group of friends around, the place felt entirely different to me when I was alone. Usually, toward the end of the day when my friends would start to head home for dinner, I'd hang back for a little while. With the sun going down behind the trees, all of the brilliant green leaves were replaced by dark shadows, and the whole area would take on a blue hue. Crickets and frogs would make their noises all around me. Bats would start to fly overhead. I was alone, but somewhere in the back of my head, I never felt certain that I was alone. As my eyes moved from tree to tree, I would always expect to see someone walking out from behind them. Maybe a fisherman coming back from a day by the river, or a teenager coming to ride his dirt bike through the field. I suppose that there were other people sometimes, though I don't remember a specific encounter. What I remember most was standing there, daring the sun to go down before I could make it home. Sometimes I would imagine wild adventures for myself as I began to make my way back home. Maybe I'd stumble upon the lair of evil foreign spies and be chased down for knowing too much. Or I would look up into the sky and see a strange light moving closer and closer until I eventually realized that it was a spaceship. I loved walking home as the sun went down and the world began to settle in for the night. Only once the sun was hidden behind the trees did I feel alone in the world. I know it's strange to say that I found this comforting, but I did. I wasn't scared of being alone. Not back then. There were days when I wouldn't make it home until well after dark, and I'd hear my mother call me into whichever room she happened to be in. She would act casual, as though she hadn't been watching the clock and waiting for me to get back, but I knew that she had been. I could tell that she worried when I was out too late. First, she would ask me why I was late. Of course, I'd tell her that I'd lost track of time. I would leave out the part about waiting for everyone else to go home so that I could walk home alone. Then she would tell me that there were rules for a reason. My mother didn't yell as she said any of this. She didn't scold me or try to make me cry. She would carry on this conversation rather casually as she went about whatever task she was performing at the time. She would tell me that we had those rules because not every kid was lucky enough to make it home in one piece. We had rules because a lot of things could happen to a kid, especially in the dark. She would tell me that she didn't like scaring me, but maybe it'd be a good idea if I did get a little scared sometimes. Then I would eat my dinner, and my father would tell me that I needed to respect the rules because I needed to respect my parents. It was their job to make sure that I was safe, and that they'd agreed to let me wander around outside under the condition that I followed their rules and got home on time. Disobeying those rules showed lack of respect, and that was hurtful to my mother. I'll admit that sometimes I just wish that they would yell at me and send me to my room like normal parents. Having civil conversations with me and explaining how I'd let them down made me feel bad about the things I'd done. After dinner, and the shower that my mother insisted I take every night in the summer to wash away the sweat and dirt from my days in the wild, I would go to bed with my window open. The night air was usually still, but it carried with it all of the sounds of a world that was entirely different from that which I had explored during the day. Predators roamed the woods at night, and I would imagine those predators as I drifted off to sleep. It's important to make you understand the world that I lived in back then. The wonder and the mystery of a child's world is unlike anything that adults experience, and once you grow up, it's hard to imagine a world that you don't understand, even if your understanding of the world is just an illusion. Kids tell themselves stories of magic and danger. Adults tell themselves stories of science and safety. In either case, we fill in the blanks of whatever we don't know with whatever makes us feel better in the moment. Huxley was my entire world back then. It was a world of incredible beauty. It was quiet. It was fun. It was isolated from whatever scandal was gripping the rest of the nation at the time. When I think of home, I think of Huxley, though I haven't been back there in years. I don't know what happened to my friends or to the house that I once lived in. I don't know how well the shine of those childhood memories lives up to the reality. I'll be going back there soon, though. I have to drive across the country on my way to a new home and a new job, closer to family, farther away from everything I've built for myself up until now. Huxley will be 3 hours off the path that my car's guidance system mapped out for me, but I need to go back there. I need to walk the streets that I walked as a child and breathe that air once again. I need to try to put some memories into perspective, because they've lingered in my head for so long that I don't know what's real and what is fiction anymore. The hope is that once I figure out how to organize these memories, I can file them away for good. We'll see how well that works out for me.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories